During the month of Family Month, we had hundreds of powerful stories of reconciliation between family members and individuals taking practical steps to have healthier families. We had a dad at one of our campuses who has been navigating a divorce but knew it was important to keep his kids in church. Turns out it's exactly what he needed as well. As he's been healing and putting in the work, staying connected at church has kept him grounded and has been a highlight each week and in the lives of his kids. One woman who visited the church for the first time with her son during Family Month told us, "I never thought church could be like this. I needed this in my life and I need to invite my family." The very next week, she brought her ex and her new partner with her to church. This was an amazing moment to see families coming together. I am just so grateful for the way that God has moved in the lives of our families here at South Hills during the month of Family Month. I also want to take a moment and give you an update of where we are with closing the year. When I shared with you in the month of October of what we were short in order to end the year, that number was $2,004,424. We are now at $1,643,902 to close the gap by the end of the year. If you look at this graph, you can see how we break up every single dollar. 46% of that dollar goes to campus and central staff so that we have staff that are leading our church. 28% of that dollar goes to campus ministry and community outreach so that we can make sure that we're doing everything possible to let people know we are here to love them and walk through life with them. 16% of every dollar goes to our mortgages and our rental fees for all of our locations, which is the building that you are currently sitting in. And 10% of every dollar goes to facility upkeep and operational costs to keep our locations up and running. I wanted to share this with you because here at South Hills, we want to be open and honest with everyone so that you know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. And as we get ready to continue to trust God with our finances and trust God with every aspect of our life, I want to begin to introduce to you something that we're going to start this year, and it's going to be called Big Give Tuesday. Every year, I want to give our church the opportunity to trust God in bigger and greater ways. So I want to challenge you as a family or as an individual, whatever your household is, I want you to ask God, what would He have you do for Big Give Tuesday? What will He want you to contribute towards November 29th as we approach this day? And why are we doing this? Because we believe that lives will be changed through this process as we allow God to transform us and trust Him with our lives.
Well, good morning. My name is Chris Kretzu, if we haven't already met, and good morning to those watching online, especially Michelle, who is hosting, not Maureen, but we won't put Kathy on blast too much today, so she's not here, so I can make fun of her as much as I want. The jokes go right over her head. That's a short joke, so that's two things in one way that I was able to just really, she's never going to help me with anything again, so... we love Kathy, and I love Pastor Moses' update, and there's a lot of things in that video, and I just want to point out a couple things. One is he breezed over this story from our Burbank campus, which is someone who came to South Hills, our Burbank campus, and they loved it, and so they invited their partner to come with them, and then also invited their ex-husband to come with them. Can you imagine that car ride to church? Like, you thought your car ride was awkward? That's incredible. And I mean, honestly, what an incredible testament to what people are experiencing and the hope that Jesus has to offer. And so I love that story. Pastor Moses also shared a little bit about our budget and the gap that we have between now and the end of the year. And in case you're new to South Hills or you haven't heard us talk about this, we're a family of churches. South Hills is not just this building that you're sitting in. There's 10 South Hills campuses. And so that budget number is for all of our churches together as a whole. And as I shared last week, I'm incredibly grateful for you guys because as we've gone throughout this year, we are actually on track with what our budget goal is, what we projected. We have a very conservative way of projecting our budget for the year, and we're on track to meet that. We're actually a little bit ahead. And so thank you for those of you that do give and are a part of that. And I want to just celebrate, because it's not just that you give some money and you drop it in a bucket. You give generously of all aspects of your life, and that's never been more clear than over the last week. This last week has been something in the Newport Mesa School District that we call Love Our Schools Week. One of the really cool things about Costa Mesa is that every single school in Costa Mesa has a church that is committed to partnering with that school and serving it on some level, whatever level that might be. And so our partner school for the last 6 years has been Ray Elementary. And so we've been doing things all week long. On Monday, we had a time of committed prayer. On Tuesday, we stocked the teacher's lounge full of coffees, cold brews, and snacks, and Diet Cokes, which was their favorite thing. We literally bought flats of Diet Coke. They found it Tuesday, and it was gone by Friday, you guys. Somebody needs to get these teachers more soda, is all I'm saying. So then on Wednesday, we showed up early. We brewed coffee and gave free coffee to all of the parents that were dropping their kids off. On Thursday, we gave out popsicles to all the kids as they left school for the day. And then on Saturday, yesterday, we had about 20, 25 people show up. We did a 4-hour serve project on that campus, did a ton of different things there. And all of that is because you decide to volunteer, to serve, to show up, to carve a few hours out of your week or your weekend. You give to something called Above and Beyond, which is our outreach fund, essentially. It's above and beyond tithes, and that money goes towards local outreach and global outreach and all these different types of things. And so thank you guys for being a part of that. And I love who our church is and who we continue to become. This last week, I was taking the car in to get the air pressure checked because the tire seemed a little bit low. I went to America's Tire Company because they'll do it for free. And if it's got a nail in it, they'll fix that for free too. Did you guys know this? Yeah. I'm not endorsed by them, but if they're listening or watching online, I am open to a sponsorship. So I got in, and I wanted to get there early, but I didn't get as early as I wanted. And so when I got there was a line. I was like, okay, I'd kind of carved out some time in my mind anyway. So I'm like, okay, so I'm just standing in line, a bunch of people in front of me. And I hear the door open behind me, and I can kind of, you can like sense people kind of restless behind you. Have you guys ever had that thing? It's like, man, somebody is behind me, and they just need to kind of chill out a little bit. Well, that was my experience in line. And so I turned around right at the same time as this lady was like doing one of these things, like trying to look around the line of people towards the front desk. And so it was like a very awkward, like we both, it was like face to face for a half a second, and it was startling, and I think she was startled. And I was like, okay, man, this lady's gonna have to be patient because there's a line. But she was not. She got out of line and walked to the front of the counter and just said, I just have a quick question. Have you guys ever been in that situation before? It's like, lady, there's a line. And there's a specific way I didn't say any of this out loud, obviously. But you could see all the other people in line. They kind of turned like all mouthing their frustration and like, respect the process. There's an order of how those things are done. And so we were all obviously bothered and annoyed and didn't actually listen to what she said. And they answered her question and it ended up being fine. But there's like that frustration of there's a specific way that this is supposed to go. There's an order of how this is supposed to go. There's a process. And when you skip the order, things go poorly. This is true in so many areas of life. This is true in cooking and baking especially. You have to do things in a certain order if you want certain things to happen. When you watch a show, like most people don't like start watching a new series by watching a middle episode. Like you want to start in a certain place. And I think maybe the best way to explain this idea of doing things in a certain order is by taking a poll of the room. And we have a slide for this as well. So if there's two kinds of people in the world. One is people that put their shoes and socks on sock, shoe. And then the other kind of person is someone who puts on sock, shoe. Okay? So show of hands, how many of you guys do sock, shoe? And then how many of you guys do sock, shoe, sock, shoe? Yeah. Psychopaths. And you can hear by the shock and awe in the room that most of us had no idea you existed in the world. Like, there is just clearly a way to put your socks and shoes on, unless you live in Orange County and you just wear flip-flops all year round and you don't have to ask the question. But it's like, in my mind, I remember a few years ago, I asked this on a Sunday morning. You may have been here then. But I asked it because I learned that week that there were people out there that did sock, shoe, sock, shoe. Like, you don't even realize that that's an option because it's wrong, right? And we all intuitively understand, no, it's sock, sock, shoe, shoe. And there's just like this, it needs to go in a right way. And there's a part of it that just we intuitively understand. You guys really discussing this? Wow. Let's just pray. I think I've impacted your hearts enough for today. We can go to lunch and talk about, there's this reality for us that there's a certain order of how things should happen. And oftentimes when we don't do things in that order, when things don't go in that order, sometimes they just don't work at all. And other times we kind of feel intuitively that something is off. And this is true in all aspects of our life. This is true in our faith as well. Something can oftentimes feel like it's not right, or it's out of place or out of order. And oftentimes it creates a sense of anxiety for us or inside of us. When you look around the room and realize that there's 4 weirdos in this room that put their shoes and socks on wrong, and the first service is only 1 weirdo. I'm just kidding. But there's a sense of kind of like, we can feel anxiety or anxious or kind of unsettled when things aren't right. I don't know if you guys are this way. I don't have this challenge, but how many of you guys have like a desk and your desk needs to be clean before you can get any work done? Like, you have to organize or straighten it up first, because otherwise it feels like there's chaos and you're unable to actually do the work. And ultimately, we see this reality of order all throughout Scripture as well. There's order that's brought to chaos, and the result is peace. In the Genesis story, in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about how in the beginning, the earth was formless and void. And I've talked about this before, and you may be tired of hearing it, but I just think it's so important for us to recognize there wasn't nothingness. There was actually chaos. The Hebrew word for formless and void is this word tohu wabohu. And this is what existed in the beginning. And so it says in Genesis that the Spirit of God hovered over this chaos, and God began to bring out of chaos creation and light and life and water and animals, and all of this good was brought out of chaos. And then we were tasked, we were given the charge or the command to subdue the earth, to take all of these things and create goodness out of that. And ultimately, in the Garden of Eden, it's described as a place where shalom existed. Out of chaos came this peace, this peaceful experience. In the Gospels, and Jesus oftentimes found himself in boats, and there was one story where he's in a boat with the disciples, and he falls asleep, and they're in the middle of the water, and there's this giant storm that kicks up, and in this storm, there's waves that are crashing, and all the disciples are terrified. They think they're going to die, and they look back to who they believe is the Messiah, and he's asleep. And so they wake him up, and they say, "Don't you even care that we're all going to die?" And in the middle of this chaotic storm, in the middle of the waves and the wind and everything, Jesus stands up, and he says, "Peace, be still." And the waves became still. The chaos was brought to a peaceful place. And even in the disciples, their anxiety began to go away, this fear of this chaos that was outside of them. And I think there's a piece for us that we can begin to understand that when we do things in a certain order, it can feel right. It can feel like it's done the right way. It can feel like we can move to the next thing. When things are done out of order, we don't feel that sense of peace. And I think that there's a principle here, kind of a base principle, that if an area of my life or of your life lacks peace, I wonder if there's something in it that's out of order. I wonder if there's something in that area that is out of order. Maybe it's a relationship and you feel like there's chaos in a specific relationship. And I wonder what it might look like to pay attention to the order of how we're doing things, the way we talk, the time we spend, the things we choose to focus on. This overflows into all kinds of different categories. And today we're going to be talking about tithing. And we're talking about the order of tithing. And it's an interesting kind of angle to take on this topic. We've talked about tithing before, and we're in this series called Blessed. Last week, we talked about this idea that God truly owns everything that we have. Our time, our talents, our resources, our gifts, our passions, everything that we have is entrusted to us by God. And we kind of live in this understanding that because he has entrusted it to us, he can ask for something back at any time. And we don't have to be upset about it because we understand it to be his in the first place. And if you missed last week, you can go back and listen to that message. If you feel like you want to be overachiever, you can do that. And today we're talking about tithing specifically. But again, I want us to think about this concept of order in the whole of our lives, not just in the order of tithing, although that's the narrow focus. There's this bigger picture if we zoom out. And I just want to be really honest with you guys, as opposed to normal when I lie a lot. And I've felt just a lot of anxiety in my own chest as I've tried to kind of chase it down this week, as I've processed through and gotten ready for this morning, and even in first service, just really kind of the whole way through. And as we were talking between services, Brandy actually was, isn't Brandy incredible? It's always amazing to have her come and lead worship with us. She was just talking and kind of helped me identify what that anxiety was. And I wanted to just say this out loud because I think it's actually an important piece. If you've been here a long time, you know that I am the number one screw up here, and I'm okay sharing those things. I never want to talk about things as though I've got it figured out or I've got it, I got something conquered, because the reality is every one of us is continuing to learn and grow. And so I think it's important for me just to say this out loud because I think it'll actually help me this morning learn and grow. I think it'll help reduce kind of the anxiousness that I feel. And also, I want you to know that we are all kind of in this journey together. Part of why I think I feel anxious about this is because my entire life really, in regards to money and finances, has been very unhealthy. I don't talk about this topic because I've got it figured out. And I think some of the anxiousness that I feel is because it's so not my skill set. It's like, I can't believe I have to talk about this. Not because I don't believe in what the Bible says or I don't believe in the idea of tithing and what God's calling us to do, just because I feel like there's probably 1,000 people that are better skilled or gifted or suited to talk about this than I am. That's the thought that I have in my mind, right? The reality is, as I'm processing it, it's that I have been on this journey of learning what does it look like, and I'm not even just talking about tithing. I'm bad with money, period, okay? So it's that's just always been my journey. And I honestly, a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I, we've been going to counseling, and not because everything's falling apart, but just because I think it's good for people to go to counseling. And one of the things that came up, I literally got emotional as we were talking about money, not because I love it so much, but because of the anxiety that I feel around money and finances. And so much of that, I feel like I can just point back and I can trace back to, I think it's because I just never did things in the right order. And I'm not talking specifically about tithing. I'm talking about money in general. I didn't have a healthy way of approaching money. About a year before Ez and I got engaged, that was about 15, 16 years ago, is the first time I was already a pastor. I had graduated pastor school and already had a job at a church. But it was a few years into that before I actually started tithing consistently. When Ez and I got married, we decided we want to continue doing this. And it was challenging and difficult, but we just kind of figured out how to budget it in. And by we, I largely mean her, because as I mentioned, I have this very anxious thing when it comes to budgets and finances. But we decided that this is something we wanted to do. And then even just a few years ago, really, we were challenged by somebody on, and this is not the point at all of this conversation, but this idea of whether we're tithing on the net or the gross. And a lot of people have this question, and most people aren't tithing on either, so the whole question doesn't actually matter if we're honest with ourselves. But we were challenged on it because of what we were doing. And so even just a couple years ago, we made another adjustment in how we were approaching this. I say all of this because I want to alleviate my own anxiety and give it to you. No, I say this because I do want to just acknowledge what it is that's happening in me, and I need to connect the dots, that it's happening in me because I lived a disordered life for decades, and I'm still feeling the effects of that. I'm not saying that because I want pity or sorrow or anything. I'm saying that because I want you to understand there's things that we can just feel over time. The natural impact and effects of these things. And I'm saying that because none of us have crossed the line of perfection or learning or growing. We are all in this boat together. Different spots in the boat, maybe, but we're all in the same boat of how do I grow? How do I learn? How do I continue to trust? And so this is what we're talking about today. And I want to go to a story that may feel a little bit weird. If we're going to talk about tithing, it may feel like a little bit of an out-of-pocket story to talk about. And honestly, this is a story, I don't know if you've ever read your Bible and you've come across a story and you've been like, hey, this story is unfair. Or this story seems like somebody got the details wrong. Like this feels like it shouldn't belong or it's backwards. And this is one of those stories for me that's been very frustrating for a long time. And over the last couple weeks, actually, I've really seen a different perspective on this. It's a story of two brothers named Cain and Abel. And it exists in Genesis chapter 4. If you have your Bibles or your Bible app, I know they'll post the scriptures in the chat room for those of you that are joining us online as well. But Genesis chapter 4, it says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve." Wink, wink. We all know what's happening here, right? Thank you. Okay. "And she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have obtained a male child with the help of the Lord," which is like just a fascinating way of saying, we had a boy. But there's this sense, it's interesting because even in the beginning, she recognizes like, yes, my husband and I made this child, but also it's because of God. It's God's goodness. It's God's kindness that we've had this child. And then it says, "And again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a cultivator of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought an offering from the firstborn of his flock and from their fat portions," which really just means this is the best cut. This is the best part of this gift, of this sacrifice or offering. "And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard." Now, it's interesting because for these brothers, there was kind of this awareness in the home or the way that they were raised. There was kind of this awareness of, I should bring an offering to God. I have gotten something and I should give something. I should honor God. I should give an offering to God in some way because they recognize ultimately that this God is the one that provided for them. And so it's really interesting because there's no rule saying that they have to do this. There's no rules or instructions on exactly what it looks like or any details or anything like that. But yet somehow God is disappointed in one of their offerings and not in the other. And I think that this is the thing that oftentimes I've found myself frustrated by in this story, is it just seems very unfair. And as I've spent time over the last couple of weeks reading this story and reading some other authors and pastors about this idea, why is it that God would accept one but reject the other? They both gave, but they didn't give the same thing and they didn't give in the same order. And it really has nothing to do with the fact that one of them gave meat and the other one gave vegetables. It's not about any of that. It's about what they gave and the order that they gave. Abel gave God his best first. and Cain gave God something at some point. In the scripture, it says that Cain, in the course of time, meaning at some point over time, Cain gave some. He didn't give God first. He didn't prioritize it. It wasn't this ordered thing. It was at some point when I get to it, I will give God some of the produce that I have harvested. And Abel gave God the firstborn, and he gave him the best of that firstborn. It was this really core idea of this is what I'm going to do first, and this is what I'm going to give. It's going to be the best, and this is because of who I believe that God is. And I think that as we start to think about the order of the world around us, and God intended for there to be order in our lives. I know it can feel chaotic, but it's not chaotic because of God. It's chaotic because of brokenness. It's chaotic because of sin. And there is this peace for us where as we begin to do things in the order that God intended for us to do things, that we're able to actually experience some of that peace in the midst of chaos. It doesn't mean that we don't have any problems. It just means that in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the problems, in the middle of the issues and the struggles and the frustrations, I actually can still have peace in that space. God essentially rejects what Cain gives because of the order that he gave it in. God doesn't actually need either the meat or the vegetables. It all actually came down to this reality of their heart position towards God, of how they viewed God, of who they believed God to be, or that they believed God was worthy of. God doesn't want our leftovers when we get around to it. And God doesn't need what we have to offer. He actually is pursuing our hearts. And Abel had a heart where he wanted to show who God was. When we give our first and the best of our resources, what we're really doing is acknowledging that God is the priority and the provider of our life. And this is what Abel is doing. It's this idea of saying that because I'm going to give my firstborn and I'm going to give the first part of this and I'm going to do this right away, it's not that God needed that sacrifice. It's that God appreciated that Abel was saying, I'm going to give you the first and the best. You are my priority and you are my provider. I recognize that in giving you the best, I'm not sure what I have left, but I trust that you'll continue to provide. I'm not going to wait to see how things shake out or how the rest of the flock comes in. You have to be very careful when you're preaching with words like flock. This stresses me out all the time. What Cain is communicating is, God, you are welcome to whatever I don't want, whatever I happen to have. I will bring you something at some point. And I think that mentality is what God is rejecting. The mentality that, yes, I believe in you. Yes, I trust you. Yes, I love you. And you will fall into whatever place in my life you will naturally fall into as I figure out what it is I want to do. We live in an apartment, and it's a decent-sized apartment, but it was built a long time ago. And I don't know if you guys live in older homes or apartments, but apparently in like the 40s and the 50s, nobody ever needed storage. There's like no cabinets, no closets. And so we just accumulate things. We don't really have a place to put them. So a few times a year, we'll kind of go through this huge purge. It's the real horror movie in our life, the Kretsu Purge. And the kids are terrified the entire time of what they're going to lose. But we started saying, hey, you know what we need to do is we need you guys to pick some things that you would like to donate. And we're going to pick some things that we want to donate. We're going to drive it all to the donation place. And I've got 2 kids, and they're both incredible, and they're very different. And one of them puts together a selection of his favorite toys because in his mind, they will be someone else's favorite toys also. It's adorable. And we're terrified because it's like, you're going to be so upset tomorrow when you don't have that toy. The other one is different. And he literally puts together a selection of the broken and missing parts of other toys that obviously he doesn't need. It's like, here's a Lego man's arm, and here's a card game I lost half the cards to. And it's like, buddy, we can't donate that. We throw that in the trash. Like, that's not worth donating. And it's a true story, but it's an extreme example. But I think for many of us, we kind of have that same wrestle. We have that same battle happening within us. It's not that I want to, we struggle with this challenge of, man, I want to give the first and the best, but then there's also this sense of, I also kind of just want to give what I don't think I actually need. I want to give when it's easy and comfortable. He's not upset about losing any of these items, but I'm giving. And it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for me. It's not just a you thing, it's an us thing. It's a me thing. Each of us as an individual, this is a challenge. And some of us are wired in ways where this is less of a challenge. I know some people that this just makes total sense in their mind, and they've never batted an eye or thought twice, and it's an easy thing for them. And there's like 1% of the world that is true for. And for so many of us, this is a challenge. The order that we do things in, the best and the first. And sometimes I think when we talk about this idea of God being our provider and our priority or putting God first, it's not that God needs us to actually put him first. Like, okay, God, I'm going to take you and put you first. There, now you're first. He already is first. It's just whether or not we recognize it. And the problem is the tension that it creates when we live a different way than what's actually been ordered. It was ordered to be that we recognize that God was first, and when we live a certain way, we experience a certain type of life. And I'm not talking about like it's not a name it and claim it. I'm not saying if you give, God will give you back that money plus more. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the peace that we come and experience in the midst of chaos. Because even though things are falling apart, I know that God is my provider and my priority, and I'm calm. And it seems like it's crazy that I'm calm. But this is what I choose to believe to be true. I lost my place in my notes. God does not need Cain's produce. He does not need Abel's animal sacrifice. He does not need your dollars. But he is interested in our hearts, and he does want us to recognize that he is first in our lives and that we rely on him to provide for us. He provides us the ability that we have to work, the relationships, the health, the skills, the resources that we have. Okay, I don't know where I'm at. I'm going to turn the page. We'll start at the top of the next page. When in doubt. All right, the story goes on for Cain and Abel. In verse 5, it says, "So Cain became very angry, and his face was gloomy." Another translation says he had a downcast soul. It says, "The Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why is your face gloomy? If you do well, will your face not be cheerful? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it.'" Now, it's interesting. There's a couple things here. One is this idea of will your face not be cheerful. It's not just talking about like, oh, he's smiling now. Everything is as it should be. He's saying, again, there's other translations that talk about will you not be accepted. And is there a deeper longing or desire that any of us have than to be accepted? Why are you feeling this heaviness? And God knows what's going on. He says, if you do well, your face, you will be accepted. And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. And I also think it's worth noting that God is not saying you're sinning by not giving me the right sacrifice. He's saying there's something happening outside of this thing that you're wrestling with. And there is something happening inside each one of us when we don't do things in order. And I think God he's identifying what it is for Cain, this idea that if you do the right thing in the proper order, you will feel accepted. You will know that you are accepted. You will feel a sense of peace. But if you don't, sin is lurking at the door. And I think that there's a reality for us, and I guess I'll just speak for myself, when things feel like they're unraveling a little bit and I'm not doing things in the right order, I tend to just kind of like go all in. It's like, well, you know what? Things are already out of order. Let's just book that European vacation anyways. Just kidding. But maybe. No. But there's this temptation that we have of kind of a bitterness or a frustration or of a struggle at believing that God really is who he is. And God is saying, it's not that I need your sacrifice, it's that I want your heart, and it's connected. These two are connected. That's why Jesus talked about this same thing. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. So I think a lot of us feel tension and anxiety around this topic, and I wonder if it's because our approach is out of order, the way we order it in our lives. So this idea of tithing is an important thing, and all throughout Scripture it talks about this. Tithing, the practical definition of tithing, is giving the first tenth of your income, of what you earn, to God through your home church. That's a practical definition of explaining what tithing is. But the reality, the spiritual reality of tithing is a little bit different. It's acknowledging God as your provider. So when I tithe, there's a practical thing that I'm doing, but in reality, I'm acknowledging that God is my provider and my priority before all else. It's an interesting and important concept. And actually, for hundreds and hundreds of years after this law of tithing was instituted, the Jewish community and the farmers, when they would it would be harvest time, and they would go out, and they wouldn't harvest everything and then take a random tenth of it to the temple. They would actually go out, and they would harvest the first tenth and leave and take it to the temple, and then they would come back for their second harvest, and it would be the rest of what was left, what they were allowed to use to live on. It was this extreme priority. And so we've just got a couple minutes left, and I want to just talk about this idea of firsts and the order, because I think there can be some common questions that people have, and I think it's worth acknowledging it. One of the questions that I've heard people ask before is like, well, if tithing is an Old Testament law, and then Jesus came, and so now there's grace, is tithing still actually required? And it's interesting because tithing, this idea, this principle actually shows up before the law. I mean, we read Cain and Abel's story, this idea of their sacrifice. But also in Genesis chapter 14, we don't have time to go there, but if you want to write it down, you can read these stories. Genesis chapter 14, Abraham realizes that God is blessing and caring for him. And in response to that, it says that Abraham took a tenth of what he had and gave it to the Lord. Later on in Genesis chapter 28, Jacob recognized God's care and provision, and he gave, it says, a tenth. Again, it's that same order, a tithe, a tenth, the same word exists. And so way before there was a law that said, there were people that understood there's an order of how I do things. And then there were laws. It was built into the Old Testament law in Exodus 23:19. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Leviticus 27, a tithe of everything from the land belongs to the Lord, and it says it is holy to the Lord. That word holy, we hear that a lot, we sing it a lot. That word holy literally just means it's set apart. It's set aside. And he's saying that tenth is set aside for God. It is all God's, and you get 90, and there's a tenth of it that's set aside for him. And then a lot of times people talk about, yeah, it's Old Testament. We don't really talk about it in the New Testament. Jesus doesn't say a whole lot about it. And in Matthew 23, there's a passage that oftentimes gets missed. Jesus is talking to some of the religious leaders, and he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, all delicious, by the way. And you know how expensive spices are. I'm just kidding. Cooking joke. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. There's a sense where Jesus is saying, and it actually shows up in the Old Testament too, where God speaks to the prophets. He says, hey, you keep bringing sacrifices, but you're ignoring the orphans and the widows and the immigrants and the people that are in need. And Jesus echoes the same thing. He says, you shouldn't ignore the latter without neglecting the former. Both. Yes, both. You should tithe and you should also care, which again is why, I'm so grateful for you guys, because you show up, you serve, you give generously above and beyond. You carve out time out of your week. You aren't neglecting one or the other. You're saying, hey, I'm going to step into these things. There's an order into which we're called to do these things. So last week we talked about this overall picture of how God has entrusted us with what we have. And today it's specifically looking at what is this order? What is this idea, this principle of firsts, first fruit, set apart, the best and the first for God? This order, it creates peace in our hearts in the midst of a chaotic world. It pushes chaos back from our minds, and it anchors us in this spiritual truth of who God is. Tithing is an action that helps us catch up with the reality of what already is. God is first. He is your provider. And when we get our things in order, we start to live experiencing that in a different way. And this is not about, I'm going to give so that I get. This is not about, I'm going to tithe so that when I really need something from God, he owes me. That's not what this is about. This is about experiencing a whole life. And for me, in my own experience, even though I talked about the anxiousness I feel when I talk about this, it has given me more than anything else, more than any other return or whatever it might be, the thing that it has given me is truly a sense of peace. Not because God owes me, but because I know I'm doing my best to prioritize in the right way. And when things are crashing or seemingly crashing around me, like, you know what? God is my provider. And I've made God my priority. And I trust he's going to come through even in the most difficult moments. So with that being said, I would love to close in prayer. If you guys will bow your heads and pray with me. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for your patience with us. I think sometimes we can come to church, we can come to a service, and there are things about who you are that are so obviously good for us. It is easy to get excited about grace. It's easy to get excited about forgiveness. It's easy to get excited about restored relationships or finding hope in darkness, or your ability to bring dead things and create life out of things that we had given up on. But there's other aspects of how you teach us, of how you call us to live, of the things that you invite us into that feel so upside down from the natural way that we think about life. And I think when we talk about money and finances and the order that you have intended for us, I think that's one of those things that it feels, sometimes I think it feels impossible. It feels scary. It feels like that can't possibly be true. And God, there's two ways we can go on this. One of them is grasping onto every single thing that we can, grasping for control and trying to make sure that we have more and more and more so that we have enough. And if we're honest with ourselves and we look out at the people that are living this way, it feels like it never quite is. Or we can live this other way where we say, okay, I'm going to trust the order that you've invited me into. I'm going to trust in who you are and who you say you are, what you will do, how you will provide. And God, as I look throughout my life, the people that are trusting you with their first and their best seem to have a lot more peace. And for me personally, that's what I want to hold on to. God, I pray that you would help each one of us just wrestle with this idea in our own hearts and our own minds. God, that you'll speak in a way that only you can. It's a gentle and kind way. It's not an angry or judgmental way. I think even as you spoke to Cain, seeing the struggle, the anxiety, the downcast soul, there's a gentle prodding and an invitation to make a change, to make an adjustment, to shift. And I imagine you speaking to me and each one of us in this room today in that same way. So I pray that we would be open to hearing that.